Khazar Khaganate is one of the most mysterious and controversial political entities of the early Middle Ages. Emerging from the ashes of the Western Turkic Khaganate, the Khazars established themselves as a regional power after defeating both the Byzantines and Arab Caliphate. The Khazars served as a sort of third party between the East and West, able to tip the scales in either favor, and becoming a master of international trade routes. However, in spite of their importance, very little has been documented about the Khazars, and the archaeological remnants are indecisive. The most controversial part of the Khazarian legacy regards their conversion to Judaism. This event, which seemingly occurred in the mid-800s, is remarkable, as it created a powerful, independent Jewish state, more than a millennium before the founding of Israel. This legacy has been used and abused throughout the ages, exemplified by the so-called Khazar myth. The Khazars have served as a Jewish literary and nationalistic icon ever since the 1100s. On the other hand, the Soviets used them as a euphemism for international Zionism. It was also long believed that Ashkenazi Jews were predominantly Khazar Turks. This was even used against the State of Israel to disprove their claims to the land, but recent genetic studies have proven that the Khazarian trace among modern Jews is insignificant. Jews are not the only ones to claim Khazar heritage. It is also common among the people of the steppe. But the Khazars are fascinating in other regards, and scholars do not only debate their religion. The Khaganate was one of the longest lasting, most stable and prosperous steppe dominions, employing a strange sort of dual monarchy to govern a diverse population of different races and religions. Despite being remembered as nomadic, the Khazar economy was complicated and dynamic, and historians struggle at labeling the Khazars as nomadic, semi-nomadic, or sedentary. They even built massive castles and cities, the bones of which can still be seen in the troubled, windswept lands of Scythia. The Khazars were a Turkic people. Most people today associate the word Turkic with the modern-day nation of Turkey, but it refers to a much older and much more diverse ethnic group. Inhabiting the Eurasian steppe from Ukraine to China, the term applied to various peoples sharing a culture and vocabulary. Not every Turk looked like your resident kebab chef. Indeed, most many Turks had dark features and looked Middle Eastern. Others yet were indistinguishable from white Europeans. Ibn Said al-Maghribi described the Khazars as having red hair, blue eyes, and white skin. Al-Ishtakri described the Khazars as having black hair, so they must have been visually and racially diverse. For some more concrete evidence, when Khazarian kurgans were excavated in the 20th century, most of the skulls belonged to a Slavic and short-skulled European type, with only a few classified as Mongolian. Genetic studies of Khazarian graves from 2019 and 21 showed significant genetic diversity among the Khazar nobility. They had traces of ancestry from the Far East, Eurasia, Europe, and Anatolia. Pretty much all of the skeletons had some East Asian ancestry, ranging from 10 to 75%. The Turkic family of languages is vast, containing many branches. Little is known about the Khazar language, owing to the scarcity of preserved material, but it is believed to have belonged to the Ugaric group, and would be related to the languages spoken in modern Turkey and Turkmenistan. The Khazars were literate, and wrote their language in Turkic runes. Such writing has been found within the empire. A cave in Kerch, 2 flasks in Novocherkassk, and on stones at the Mayaki hill fort. But the only runes we know for certain to be Khazar comes from a signee of the Kievan letter. They simply read Okurim, meaning, I have read it. The rest of the letter was written in Hebrew, which, after the conversion of the Khazars, served as the court and liturgical language. The letter itself is quite mundane, concerning a dispute of money. There were many legends on the origins of the Turks and of the Khazars. As documented in Chinese chronicles, the Turks believe themselves to be the descendants of wolves. It's basically furry fanfic, checks out why my taxi driver is so hairy. Where do you want to go, boss? Old legends were later merged with Abrahamic ones. The Jewish Khazars could trace their origins to Noah. Other Jews who visited Khazaria said that they descended from one of the 12 tribes. Since Judaism is an ethnic religion, according to its orthodoxy, your mother must have been Jewish for you to be Jewish. And these stories were most likely written to justify the Khazarian conversion, since there is little factual evidence of Jewish heritage among them. It is not certain when the Khazars first emerged as a distinct ethnic group. Alleged mentions of them in the 6th century have been debunked. The earliest written mention comes from a 7th century Armenian source, written by Ananias of Sirach. He describes how the Ikashrak were chased from the mountains of the Bulgars, establishing themselves around the western coast of the Caspian Sea. The region was controlled by the Western Turkish Khaganate, established in 552 by Khagan Ishtemi. Following a period of civil strife, the Khaganate broke up in the 630s, allowing the Khazars to fill the vacuum of power, carving out a new dominion along the Caspian coast, from the banks of the Volga to the Caucasus Mountains. The mountains served as a buffer zone between the Khazars and the Arab Caliphate. In the mid-7th century, Islam was a brand new religion, having only been established a few decades earlier by the Prophet Muhammad. His successors had rapidly expanded across the Middle East, and after conquering Sasanian Persia, their northern expansion was halted by the Khazars. Had it not been for them, Islam might have expanded deep into Eastern Europe and beyond. Whilst the Caucasus blocked Khazarian expansion southwards, the west lay open for conquest. The Khazars established themselves on the coast of the Black Sea, primarily around the Sea of Azov and upon the Taman Peninsula. Their influence was soon felt on Crimea, whose coastal cities belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire, commonly called Byzantium. Relations between the Romans and Khazars were amicable at first. In 685, the post-emperor Justinian II fled to Crimea, where he married a Khazar princess, known in the records as Theodora. The new emperor asked the Khazars to assassinate Justinian, but he was warned by his wife and escaped once more. With the help of a Bulgar ruler, he managed to recover the Byzantine throne. The Khazars were rewarded for their service and allowed a special seat in Constantinople. But relations soured in 710, when the Crimean city of Kherson rose up in rebellion, assisted by the Khazars. Relations did not fully heal until a few years later, when the two powers found a common enemy in the Caliphate. The Khazars and Byzantines would continue to have a rocky relationship, with a great amount of intermarriage. Most notable is perhaps the emperor between 775 and 1780, nicknamed Leo the Khazar, born to a Khazar mother, baptized Irene. One of the most important consequences of the Arab-Khazar Wars was the influx of refugees into the northern Caucasus. Archaeological evidence points to an intense settlement around the Sea of Azov, starting around 730. This gave rise to what archaeologists call the Saltava culture. In the school of archaeology, culture basically refers to findings indicated to have belonged to one particular society. Archaeological cultures tend to be discussed somewhat independently of written records, but the Saltava culture is generally associated with the Khazars. However, this is somewhat of a simplification. The Saltava culture seems to have encompassed a multitude of ethnic groups, governed by and sometimes independent of the Khazars, including Bulgars and Alans, but also Pechenegs, Ogush, and even settled communities of Ugrians, Slavs, and Caucasians. It must be noted that, from the beginning of the empire, the Khazars ruled over a diverse population. The Khazars are most often recognized as a nomadic power, horse lords akin to the Seljuks or even Mongols. This brings to mind a barbarian warlord riding into your town, burning it down and placing your wife upon his saddle, all the while throat singing. Reality seems to have been much more complicated. Pure nomads are generally pastoralist. They sustain themselves on livestock and move seasonally in search of better pastures. The stereotypical nomad aggression comes from their need of equipment, which could only be gathered from settled societies through raiding or tribute collection. Of course, The Eurasian steppe societies were much more complicated than the stereotype, and often produced magnanimous cultures. Nor were they always 100% nomadic. Instead, the Khazars are typically branded as semi-nomadic, a somewhat complicated term with a lot of nuance. It usually implies a decrease of pastoral grounds, with the nomads usually switching between set winter and summer camps. Within these camps, the nomads might engage in agriculture and craftsmanship. The Khazars seem to have begun the semi-nomadic lifestyle in the 8th century, coinciding with the influx of refugees, who would drastically increase the density of settlements. Again, it must be mentioned how diverse the Khazarian subjects were. Not only were they ethnically and religiously diverse, but also economically. Some of them were purely nomadic, others were semi-nomadic, and others were entirely sedentary, with many nuances in between, which often changed depending on the region, and often evolved or devolved, depending on social circumstances and even climate change. However, these different groups were never isolated. Archaeology indicates that the different lifestyles convalesced in shared markets. The Khazarian nomads tended to animals like horses and sheep. Semi-nomads and farmers tended to cattle, goats, birds, donkeys, and pigs. Beekeeping was also a common activity, as was hunting. They were also said to be excellent fishermen. The farmers produced millet, wheat, barley, rye, hemp, and garden vegetables, usually peas. They used a variety of tools, and the grains were ground into flour in manually operated millstones. The excess was stored in grain pits. Wealthier farmers produced melon, cucumber, grapes, and cherries. And craftsmanship was also common. The Khazars engaged in blacksmithing, pottery, and jewel crafting. What distinguished Khazaria from other nomadic empires was how deeply they settled into the steppe zone, which is generally unsuitable for agriculture. Here they constructed a remarkable number of cities, another one of their distinguishing marks. Within these cities, the Khazars primarily lived in yurts, circular felt tents with a central fireplace. Others lived in small clay houses or dwellings with stone foundations, divided into rooms. Only the state was allowed to build with brick, so this material was reserved for royal and public buildings. The original capital of the Khazars was Balanjar, situated on the foot of the Caucasus Mountains. The location made it susceptible to invasion, and it was the site of the first ever clash between the Arabs and Khazars. Even though the Khazars were victorious, they made the decision of moving their capital northwards. Wisely so, for Balanjar was brutally sacked in 723. The capital was briefly moved to Samandar, located further up the Caspian coast. Initially constructed in the 6th century by the Persian emperor, it would remain one of the greatest Khazarian cities until the fall of the Khaganate. It was noted for its vineyards and would accumulate a prosperous and diverse population. In the 10th century, skipping ahead a bit, it was described as a market city, home to Christians, Jews, pagans, and Muslims. They lived in wooden buildings with domed roofs. Despite Samandar's prosperity, the capital was shortly after moved to Atil, situated on the mouth of the Volga River on the northern Caspian coast. The two districts were connected by a pontoon bridge, and it served as a center of trade and religion. The city was even noted for having many baths. The Khagan lived in a palace of brick, decorated by a golden gate. The high military commander, the Beg, resided in his own castle. Indeed, the Khazars were noted for their construction of castles and hill forts. One of the most prominent is the fortress of Sarkel, the ruins of which are situated in the modern-day Rostov Oblast of southern Russia. Known as the White Fortress, it was constructed around 833, with the help of Byzantine architects. This can be seen in its marble columns and capitals, though most of its features are iconic to the Saltava culture. Brick was the chief material, and many of them were marked by tamgas, symbols of the Khazar clans. These were believed to have magical powers, but could also just have implied which clan had made the brick, or simply that the bricks had been finished. Other bricks were marked with geometric patterns, or images of creatures. The fortress housed a garrison of around 300 men, and most believe it was constructed to keep out the Magyars. Similar castles were built. The Khazars also inhabited hill forts, and all of these defensive structures served multiple purposes. As aforementioned, they protected the local inhabitants from hostiles. Secondly, they served as outposts in the trade network. Lastly, they were the residences of the Khazar nobility. The upper class seems to have consistently maintained a semi-nomadic lifestyle. During the winter season, they would reside within their castles, and during the summer, move with their herds into better pastures. The nomadic roots of the Khazars also worked well into the collection of tribute and managing of the state. The lifestyle allowed the rulers to seasonally move from city to city, subject to subject, collecting the tribute which they relied upon to manage their large military. The reason why the Khazars were able to govern such a large and diverse population was due to the many threats posed to them. Aside from the Arab invasions, nomadic groups like the Magyars and Pechenegs would frequently migrate through Khazarian lands. A basic but very stable social contract emerged. You stay loyal and pay us tribute, and we protect you. Originally, Khazaria was ruled as an absolute monarchy by the Khagan. This was essentially the title of emperor among the Turkic peoples, who believed him to have been selected by Tengri, god of the sky. So aside from fulfilling the political role, the Khagan also had a religious purpose. Upon the inauguration of a new Khagan, a ritual killing was carried out, where he was almost strangled to death with a silken cord. This tradition seems to be ancient, and was used from the banks of the Dnipro to the Great Wall of China. The Khazar Khagans are believed to have belonged to a single bloodline, a part of the Ashina family. The Ashinas had likewise controlled the eastern and western Turkish empires, and Ashina descendants was regarded as of spiritual importance. They most likely had their own tamga, but it doesn't seem certain what tamga the rulers had. There were of course a multitude of other symbols present in Khazaria. In the thumbnail I feature what looks like a Star of David, based on this archaeological finding. Whilst it certainly could be, some scholars believe it to be a shamanistic sun disk. The points of the star meant to represent the rays of the sun. Though I don't know if the Khazars had any special affinity for blue and white, that's just clickbait to provoke the keyboard warriors. Initially, the Khagan had been the sole ruler of the empire and led his armies to glory. But starting in the late 700s, he would gradually lose power to a chief military commander, the Bek. Between 838 and 843, all military and political responsibilities were transferred over to the Bek, with the Khagan reduced to a sacral figurehead. A comparison is often drawn to the shogunate period of Japan, when the emperor served as official head of state, but only really held a ceremonial, spiritual role. Portuguese sources even compared him to the Catholic Pope, whereas all political authority lay in the hands of the shogun, a military dictator. Below the Bek were the Kender and Yavshigar, state officials who carried out administrative assignments. Issues of trade and religion were primarily settled by a judicial court of 7 members, 2 Jews, 2 Muslims, 2 Christians, and a pagan. He represented the Slavs of the realm. Provincial governors were known as Tudun. They were personally appointed by the Khagan and responsible for collecting taxes. Military commanders were known as Tarkhans. They were most likely high nobility, often carrying out expeditions abroad, and sometimes serving as governors. According to Muslim sources, the Khazar army was a professional standing one, unlike the forces of their neighbors. Cavalry formed the backbone, armed with spears and bows, and the Khagan made diligent use of foreign mercenaries. In the Khazar army served nomads, Slavs and Vikings. Most prominent were Muslim guards, usually levied from Khwarezm. The Khagan likewise had a Muslim palace guard, and like most palace guards, they would become politically influential. In terms of equipment, the Khazars seem to have been the first empire of the steppe to have used the saber. Some of the Rus apparently regarded their own straight swords to be superior, since they were double-edged. In the primary chronicle, an anecdote comparing the swords of the two nations is used to foreshadow the Rus supplanting the Khazars as the dominant force of the region. Spoiler! Ironically, the Rus themselves would quickly adopt the saber. Sabers have been found in Rus graves and can be seen on medieval illustrations. Fast forward a few hundred years, and the saber would become the go-to cavalry sword of the Western world. The prestige of the Khazar military had an effect on the wider world. Khazar helmets and armor were likewise adopted by the Rus, and their influence can be seen as far as Birka in Sweden. Another popular fashion item were belt sets, seemingly produced in Attil. Reaching Crimea, Volga Bulgaria and the Rus, these were important marks for any warrior of status. The professional military of the Khazar Khaganate is often seen as a cause and a result of their trade economy. Trade was a vital component of the imperial machinery, and some go so far as to say that their economy was entirely dependent upon it. But I'm fast forwarding a bit. Hostilities with the Arabs continued throughout the 7th and 8th centuries. It was a brutal back and forth, with the Khazars invading Armenia and the Arabs launching counterattacks into Khazaria. Attempts at friendship proved futile. This bloody seesaw continued swinging until the mid-8th century, when the Umayyad dynasty was toppled by the Abbasids. The new regime sought to consolidate the caliphate and revitalize trade, thus establishing a peaceful relationship with the Khazars. Khazaria's position upon the Silk Road would allow it to serve as an important mediator between the East and West. It has often been argued that Khazaria was entirely dependent on international commerce in order to maintain its army and thus the state. However, it appears as if the internal economy of Khazaria was not only diverse, consisting of both pastoralists, farmers and craftsmen, but also self-sufficient. The mainstream argument nowadays seems to be that trade was one of the many legs which the empire stood upon. Take it away and the table doesn't fall, but it starts to lean. The most important exports were furs, especially black pelts from foxes and martens. These animals did not dwell within Khazaria itself, but had to be collected as tribute from the Slavic and especially Ugrian tributaries in the north. These pelts were highly prized in the Mediterranean and Middle East, and trade of it seems to have preceded the Khazars by a couple of centuries. The second most important commodity was slaves, usually captured in raids against the Slavs and Ugrians, something which the horse warriors would have excelled at. These slaves could not be exported in the massive quantities expected for, say, labor duties, mining, construction, etc., but were instead a sort of luxury for the upper classes. The slaves would have become household servants, harem women, sex slaves, even warriors. An issue can be found in these types of exports. Neither of them were native to the Khazarian heartland. Indeed, the Khazars weren't so much producers or traders themselves, and most of their trade income came from tolls imposed on everyone passing through. This made the Khazars dependent on outside groups to manage the commerce. First came the Sogdians of Central Asia. Hailing from cities like Suyab and Talas, they seem to have penetrated into Eastern Europe long before the Khazars, and it wasn't until the peace with the Caliphate that they began to travel through Khazaria itself. This can be evidenced by findings of silver coins, the most prominent means of exchange. Arab coins were struck across the Caliphate. They could come from the Caucasus, Syria, Transoxiana, or even as far as North Africa, even Spain. Very often, the Sogdians would leave their mark on the coins in the form of graffiti. One of the Khazars' chief supply of slaves were the Volga Bulgars. Bulgarian Khans would sometimes be nicknamed King of the Sakaliba by the Arabs, and Sakaliba meaning white Europeans, owing to the amount of white slaves they captured and exported. The Khazars' conversion to Judaism made them a welcoming host to the Radhanites. These were Jewish merchants from Spain and France who organized a massive trade network, stretching from Europe to China. They served as a vital mediator between the worlds of Christendom, Islam, and the Middle Kingdom, and Khazaria was vital for their prosperity. The Radhanites frequently operated with the Vikings, who provided them with slaves. The Vikings of the East, known as the Rus, would become an increasingly important player in Khazarian affairs. Their mastery of shipcraft allowed them to control the riverways of the region, the most efficient medium of travel, and they would construct their own bases in the north, from which to extract tribute and capture slaves. The tribute and the spoils were then traded in or exported through Khazaria. The Rus would become part of the Khagan's army, and even had their own district in the city of Atil. However, unlike the previous factions, the Rus were especially ambitious. They assumed the title of Khagan for their own ruler, seemingly to legitimize their overtaking of Khazar tributaries, and as a method of usurping the nomadic power. So too would they adapt Khazar clothing, weaponry, and customs. Many East Slavic words are believed to have originated from the Khazar language, including but not limited to Bogati, meaning knight, Telega, meaning wagon, and Verv, meaning house community. These different groups would travel through Khazaria on their way to the end goals of the different trade routes. Khazaria was perfectly situated in the middle of all worlds, allowing them to sit back and reap the precious fruits. As long as an alternate trade route wasn't discovered, Khazaria would prosper. I think it's about time that we discuss the conversion to Judaism, often recognized as the most remarkable event in Khazarian history. Now, there are many who have denied and probably will deny the Khazarian conversion, even if it was spoken of by so many different contemporary sources. Khazar documents such as the Reply of King Joseph, the Shechte letter and the Kievan letter, reports from Arab and Persian sources like Ibn Fadlan, Al-Istakri and Ibn Rushda, the Frankish commentary, Expositio in Mattheum Evangelistam by Christian of Stavelot, and Jewish books, such as the Sefer HaKabbalah by Abraham ibn Daud and Sefer HaKuzari by Yehuda Halevi, to name a few. In historical research, it is known that nothing in the past can be known for certain, and every history is to some extent a story, a narrative, constructed by what limited knowledge we actually have. The fewer and less varied sources we have of something, the less reliable the story becomes. But if there are a lot of sources, written by people of vastly different backgrounds and ideologies, all saying the same thing, we can be more confident that we're close to something like the truth. Of course, religion on the steppe was complicated. Most of the Turkic peoples followed the traditional cult of Tengri, the sky god, but this religion was remarkably flexible, allowing the Turks to integrate and modify new religions and relations as they were encountered. During the Middle Ages, Buddhism, Confucianism, Zoroastrianism, Nestorianism, and Manichaeism all coexisted among the Turco-Mongols, alongside of Tengrism. So in this context, the conversion to Judaism isn't especially strange, and it doesn't imply a complete overhaul of Khazar society, rather the integration of new customs into their existing framework. Jews have inhabited Eastern Europe since the days of Rome, but faced the occasional bout of persecution. The Byzantines tried their hardest to convert the Jews, and by the end of the 9th century, they weren't allowed to marry Christians, own Christian slaves, or hold any public offices. Whilst many of the Jews converted, others decided to flee, and Khazaria became a lucrative host owing to its tolerance. According to the Shechte letter, Jews intermarried with Khazars and began to propagate some of their rituals, including circumcision. Youch. Other Jews came from Mesopotamia and Persia. This steady trickle of Jews into Khazaria and the popularity of their customs was certainly a driving factor in converting the Khazars. Around 1327, Arab historian Dimashqi wrote the following: "The Jews came to the Khazar country, where they found an intelligent but untutored race, and offered them their religion. The inhabitants found it better than their own, and accepted it." Modern historians have offered alternative interpretations. Some believe it was a conscious decision to preserve the political independence of Khazaria from Christian Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate. Others say it was purely due to the influence of the Radhanite merchants. The Khazars officially converted to Judaism during the reign of King Bulan, in the first half of the 9th century. According to legend, Bulan had invited scholars from the different religions to have a debate on which one the Khazars should adopt. There was significant disagreement between the scholars, especially the Christian and the Muslim. So Bulan first asked the Christian which of the opposing two religions he preferred. He then asked the Muslim the same. Both of them preferred Judaism over Islam or Christianity. Therefore, Bulan saw Judaism as the root of the other two religions, and converted. Afterwards, he and his slaves circumcised themselves, and he brought in wise men from Israel to interpret the Torah and arrange the precepts in order. The motif of a religious debate seems quite common in medieval history books. It also appears in the primary chronicle to explain why Vladimir I converted to Christianity instead of Judaism or Islam. But it is not the only origin story. Around 1009, Arab historian Abd al-Jabbar wrote how a single missionary was responsible for the conversion. This legend was later adopted by Jewish scholars. Others say that Bulan was visited by an angel. There is also archaeological evidence for the earliest date of Khazar conversion. A coin struck around the year 837 bears the text, "Moses is the messenger of God." Previous Khazar coins had borne the text, "Muhammad is the servant and messenger of Allah," as a few Khazar rulers had had flirtations with Islam. This coin is then taken as concrete evidence of the Khazarian state conversion. It is uncertain if Bulan was Khagan, as he was never identified as such, and he and his successors wielded military capabilities more akin to the Bek. It is not entirely certain if and how the role of the Khagan changed with the conversion to Judaism. Some believe the conversion to be the cause for his resigning of power to the Bek and descendants into a figurehead. Others believe it simply led to the abandonment of certain rites incompatible with Judaism, like the suffocation of the Khagan, which would have broken the Jewish prohibition of human sacrifice. But eventually, it was dictated that only a Jew could become Khagan. The Shechter letter claims that the first Jewish Khagan was an Israelite sage appointed by the Khazars. This would have broken the presumed tradition of only appointing members of the Ashina family. It is very interesting that the Khazars did not abandon the Khagan and the pagan tradition with the conversion to Judaism. Rather, that they integrated this new religion with their traditional customs. There were no doubt many other customs and rites which saw a similar process, but these have been lost to time. Furthermore, Judaism was not only the religion of the royalty, but of the entire Khazarian tribe. Certainly there were outliers, and they would continue to govern different ethnic groups with their own religions. The Khazar Khaganate is one of the strangest, most mysterious and poorly documented political entities of the medieval steppe. For 3 centuries it dominated the bridge between East and West, and suddenly, in the late 10th century, it just collapsed. Khazaria vanished. A Rus prince named Sviatoslav decided to invade for ambiguous reasons, and within a few years, and seemingly without much effort, Khazaria had fallen. The fall of Khazaria has been hotly debated in the historical community, without any form of consensus. In general, it is difficult to find one single reason behind the downfall of any society or political entity. Usually it is a death by 1,000 cuts, many different reasons, internal and external, and causing the foundations to collapse in on themselves. For Khazaria, historians have blamed the shifting of trade, nomadic incursions, religious disputes, and even climate change. The concept of climate change as a cause behind Khazarian collapse always seemed very interesting to me. During the 10th century, the climate in Europe became more humid, more wet. The waters of the Dnipro rose, along with the groundwater. This had a negative impact on agriculture in the Don region, the region most heavily inhabited by the Saltava culture. Evidence points to the majority of settlements in this region being abandoned. However, these changes would have occurred slowly, over time, not even within the scope of a decade. This would have allowed the farmers to migrate to more preferable areas, or even to adapt a more semi-nomadic or even fully nomadic lifestyle, which was unaffected by the climate change. This economic dynamism was part and parcel of Khazarian history, not to mention that agriculture formed but one of many economic systems within Khazaria, whose economy was very flexible. So whilst the decline of agriculture in the Don area certainly led to instability and a weakening of certain regions, and climate change cannot be solely blamed for the collapse, at least until further research has been conducted in the field. The weakening of the Khazar agriculture allowed for the incursion of nomads, another cause usually cited for Khazarian collapse. The Pechenegs were a nomadic tribe, occupying the steppe between the Volga and Ural mountains during the 9th century. They are noted for having forced the migration of the Magyars, who would later move into the Carpathian Basin, where they established the Kingdom of Hungary. The relationship between the Pechenegs and Khazars has been debated, with some believing in a decades-long intrusion into Khazaria, and even a significant shrinking of its borders. Others believe that the Pecheneg migration was caused by climate change, the eastern steppe zone drying up as the rainfall shifted, and that they were too weak to fight the Khazars. They were simply passing through on their way to greener pastures in the west. Both camps use archaeology to prove their point. Some say the abandonment and destruction of settlements in Khazaria was due to the Pechenegs, others due to climate change. But again, this only occurred in a small part of one of the many Khazarian regions, and though it is still uncertain what happened, Pecheneg invasion cannot be given as the sole cause for the Khazarian collapse. Religion and diversity along the strength of Khazaria has also been blamed as the cause for collapse. Indeed, some believe that the Khazars fought a long and exhausting civil war over religion. The Jewish Khazars came out on top, and this would have led to a divide between the Jewish Khazars and the subjects of different religions, already weakened by the climate change and decline of trade. Archaeology proves that international commerce declined in Khazaria during the 10th century. In the late 9th century, Arabic silver coins stopped appearing in Eastern Europe, most likely as the result of a trade crisis. The crisis was resolved around 900, but not in the favor of the Khazars. An alternative route had been created, one which bypassed Khazaria completely, instead going through the Volga Bulgars, which were becoming increasingly powerful and independent of the Khazars. Another Khazarian subject that was becoming independent were the Rus. The Rus had long seemed interested in controlling the eastern commerce, but they didn't actually clash with the Khazars until 913. The Khazar king allowed a Rus fleet to pass through his lands on a raiding expedition into the Caliphate. The expedition was brutally successful, but on their way back home, the Rus were betrayed. As aforementioned, the Khazar army consisted in large part of Muslim soldiers, Orsia, and they had caught wind of the massacres against their brothers in faith. As the Rus entered the city of Atil, the Orsia attacked them, and were even joined by some of the Christians. After 3 days fighting, 30,000 Rus had been slaughtered, and the 5,000 survivors forced to retreat. Many of those who escaped were caught by the Bulgars and killed. The Rus were now eager for vengeance, and in 940 they launched an attack on the Khazars. It ended in disaster, and though attempts of alliance were made between the Rus and Khazars, it would not be successful. In the 950s, King Joseph of Khazaria wrote a letter where he described Khazaria as a sort of bulwark, protecting the Muslim world against Rus raiding parties. According to him, were I to let them pass through even one at a time, they would destroy the whole land of the Ishmaelites, as far as Baghdad. Hyperbole much? By this point, the Rus had become firmly cemented as an enemy of Khazaria. At the same time, the Khazars were losing control of Crimea, one of their most prized possessions. In 962, they deployed a significant army to reassert their control. Many villages and cities were destroyed. Khazaria had been able to function as an empire because it had a stable and flexible foundation, a trade economy that could supply a large professional army, able to protect its diverse population. Now, climate change and intrusions were eating away at the foundations. The trade economy had shrunk, likely leading to a downsizing of the army, and thus the Khaganate's ability to control and protect its population. Furthermore, the Khazars didn't have anything close to a navy, rendering them completely susceptible to the longships of the Rus. Looking at a map of the region, it is dominated by a network of rivers, and being able to traverse and control them effectively was key to any successful empire. The actions of the Khazars in Crimea shows a collapse of the social contract between lord and subject, and also a sign of desperation. The Crimean Goths pleaded for the Rus to protect them against the Khazars. Their old social contract had failed, and they needed a new master to protect them. Interestingly, The Goths shared a distant Scandinavian heritage with the Rus. It is unknown if this would have played a part in their plea, but the prospect of it is certainly interesting. Knyaz Sviatoslav answered the call, and in the 960s launched his invasion of Khazaria. In 965, he first captured the city of Sarkel and subjugated the Alans and Circassians. In 967, he beat up the Bulgars and conquered the Khazarian capital of Atil. Samandar and its famous vineyards were burned, the city reduced to ashes. Archaeologically, this brought an end to the Saltava culture in the region, as the Slavs began to colonize the former lands of the Khazars. However, many of the Khazars managed to escape, some to Volga, Bulgaria, where remnants of the Saltava culture continued. Others yet fled to an island in the Caspian Sea, and others to Baku. The latter were attacked by the Muslims and forced to convert to Islam. Indeed, the Khagan himself had converted in a desperate attempt to gain allies against the Rus. It was all for nothing. Khazaria had fallen, and it would take over 1,000 years for an independent Jewish state to rise again. However, the Khazars would live on. The Rus allowed them some form of political independence, and they were even allowed to keep their Khagan. The last Khagan was a Christian named Georgios Tsul, similarly positioned in Crimea. In 1016, the Rus and Byzantines launched a joint expedition against Khazaria, led by a pair of dudes named Svengus and Mongus, probably the goofiest duo I've heard of today. The Khagan was imprisoned, and the Khazarian rump state integrated into Rus. The Khazars split up across the world. Some moved as far away as Hungary, Poland, Lithuania, even Spain. Others lived within Rus, in the city of Kiev. Within 2 centuries, they had disappeared as a distinct ethnic group. However, the memory of them would remain strong. The region was still referred to as Khazaria in Byzantine and Italian documents, as far as the 15th century. In several languages, the Caspian Sea is known as the Khazar Sea, and the Azerbaijanis still speak of a northern wind, the Khazri wind. In Jewish tradition, Khazaria would live on as a symbol of pride. Even though we know next to nothing about Khazaria, the fact that its people live on in memory is a testament to its once power and influence. In all regards, from economy to religion, Khazaria is one of the most fascinating and mysterious entities from one of the most fascinating and mysterious regions and chapters of history. And I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed researching and writing it. If you want to support my channel, you can hop over to Patreon and become a regular donor. If you want to enjoy more of my content, I'd suggest not only subscribing, but also clicking the notification bell, as YouTube can be a bit shady with showing you my videos. If you want to learn more about the Khazars and the Rus, I have plenty of videos on the latter, and I intend to make a video on Sviatoslav, the mad lad who conquered Khazaria with seemingly no effort. If this video performs well, I'll probably also make an episode on the Volga Bulgars. Until then, I suppose.